What if the moment that sealed Nazi Germany's fate didn't happen in the smoking ruins of Berlin in 1945? What if it happened years earlier, at the exact peak of Adolf Hitler's power, when almost nobody in the world would have believed defeat was even possible? By the summer of 1941, Hitler looked unstoppable. Country after country had gone down before the German war machine, and each one had fallen faster than the last. Poland was crushed in weeks. Then Norway and Denmark, then Belgium and the Netherlands. Until France, a nation with one of the most respected armies in Europe, collapsed in a matter of 6 weeks. Too much of the world, it seemed like Germany had built something unbeatable, an empire whose momentum simply could not be stopped. But history has a strange habit of turning on a single decision. A choice that looks bold and brilliant in the moment can, with the benefit of hindsight, turn out to be the very thing that unravels everything. Many historians point to one decision above all others as Hitler's greatest and most consequential mistake. Not a lost battle, not a failed order on some particular day. A single strategic gamble so enormous in scale that it quietly transformed Germany from a seemingly invincible power into a nation locked in a war it could never actually win. That decision was the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory in an operation codenamed Barbarossa. To this day, the largest land invasion the world has ever seen. Thousands of tanks rolled east, the sky filled with aircraft. Millions of rounds of ammunition had been stockpiled for months in preparation. Hitler was convinced the Soviet Union would collapse within a matter of weeks, certainly no longer than a few months. And his confidence wasn't pulled out of thin air, it came from experience. Germany's earlier campaigns had been shockingly effective. The strategy the world came to know as Blitzkrieg lightning war relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming concentrated force to shatter enemy lines before they could regroup or even understand what was happening. It had worked against Poland. It had worked against France. Many senior German officers genuinely believed the Soviet Union, a country they viewed as backward and poorly led, would fold even more as Hitler himself shared that belief completely. He dismissed the Red Army as disorganized and weak, in large part because Stalin's political purges in the years before the war had gutted much of the officer corps. He also assumed that once German forces seized the western, industrialized parts of Soviet territory, the entire Soviet economy would simply grind to a halt. But there was one factor Hitler consistently, almost stubbornly, underestimated: the sheer size of the country he was invading. The Soviet Union wasn't just another line on a map to be crossed and conquered. It was enormous, larger than anything German forces had ever tried to fight across. Every kilometer gained to the east stretched the supply lines a little further. Fuel had farther to travel. Spare parts took longer to arrive at the front. Heavy rain turned unpaved roads into thick, sucking mud that slowed tanks and trucks to a crawl. Even the railways worked against the Germans. Soviet tracks used a different gauge than German ones, meaning engineers had to rebuild entire stretches of rail line before supplies could move forward at all. In other words, every mile of battlefield success made the logistics behind that success harder to sustain. And yet, in those first weeks and months, the results on the ground were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. City after city fell. To outside observers watching from London or Washington, it genuinely looked like Hitler's prediction might come true, that the Soviet Union could collapse before the first snow of winter. Then, something happened that nobody in the German high command had planned for. The Soviet Union simply refused to break. Instead of falling apart, it absorbed catastrophic losses and kept fighting anyway. Entire factories, machinery, workers, blueprints, everything were dismantled and shipped thousands of kilometers east. Beyond the Ural Mountains, far out of reach of German bombers, where production resumed almost as though nothing had happened, millions of ordinary civilians were pulled into the war effort. New divisions kept arriving at the front, seemingly out of nowhere, even as casualty numbers climbed into the millions. For every Soviet army the Germans destroyed, another one appeared to take its place. German commanders on the ground started to notice something they didn't like. Victory was taking longer than it should have. Every delay put more strain on already stretched supply lines. Every tank lost in combat became harder to replace. Every experienced soldier killed represented years of training that Germany simply could not replicate quickly enough. And then a second problem emerged, this one coming not from the enemy, but from Hitler himself. He changed his mind about what mattered most. Rather than throwing every available resource toward Moscow, the Soviet capital, and just as importantly, a critical transportation and rail hub, Hitler diverted large portions of his forces south toward Ukraine, chasing farmland and, further still, the oil fields of the Caucasus. Some of his own generals pushed back hard, arguing that Moscow had to remain the priority if the campaign was going to succeed before winter. Others agreed with Hitler that securing resources mattered just as much as taking the capital. Historians still argue about which approach would have given Germany the better shot at victory. What isn't up for debate is the cost of indecision itself. Changing the objective mid-campaign burned through weeks that Germany didn't actually have to spare, and time, as it turned out, was about to become Germany's most dangerous enemy of all. By the time German forces finally turned their full attention back toward Moscow, autumn had already arrived, and with it, the rains. Heavy, relentless rainfall turned Soviet roads, most of which were unpaved to begin with, into thick rivers of mud. It was a phenomenon Russians simply called Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, and it swallowed German vehicles whole. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses pulling supply wagons strained and collapsed under the weight of the mud sucking at every wheel. Convoys that should have taken a day to reach the front stretched into a week or more. Some supplies never arrived at all. Then, almost without warning, the mud froze, and winter arrived in force. German planners back in Berlin had never seriously prepared for a winter campaign, because the entire strategy had been built around finishing the war before winter ever became a factor. It was a fatal assumption. Vast numbers of German soldiers were still wearing the same uniforms they'd worn in the summer heat. Engine oil froze solid overnight, so tanks that had rolled effortlessly through Poland and France now wouldn't even start. Machine guns jammed in the extreme cold. Frostbite began claiming as many soldiers as enemy fire did, sometimes more. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front line, something was shifting. Soviet intelligence had concluded correctly that Japan had no intention of opening a second front against the USSR from the east. That single piece of intelligence freed up dozens of fresh, well-trained Siberian divisions, soldiers who had spent their entire lives adapting to brutal winters, to be rushed west to defend Moscow. They arrived at exactly the moment German forces were at their most exhausted, most undersupplied, and least prepared for the cold. For the first time since the war in the West had begun, the German army was stopped in its tracks, not driven back in humiliating retreat, not yet, but stopped, unable to take Moscow, unable to press further, forced instead to dig in and simply survive the winter. The military impact mattered, but the psychological impact mattered just as much, maybe more. The myth of German invincibility, the idea that it carried Hitler's armies through 6 countries in under 2 years, had finally cracked in front of the entire world, and the consequences of that single failed campaign rippled far beyond the battlefield outside Moscow. Germany was no longer fighting one war. It was now locked into a grinding, prolonged conflict against the Soviet Union in the east, while Britain continued to resist in the west, refusing to negotiate any kind of peace. Then, in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Days later, Hitler made another decision that historians still puzzle over. He declared war on the United States, a country with almost limitless industrial capacity, and no German forces anywhere near its own soil. Overnight, Germany found itself facing 3 of the most powerful nations on Earth simultaneously. The Soviet Union brought a scale of manpower that seemed almost bottomless, along with an industrial base that, once relocated east of the Europe, proved nearly impossible to bomb into submission. Britain controlled critical shipping lanes across the Atlantic and continued to serve as a staging ground for future Allied operations in Europe, and the United States brought something Germany simply could not match: raw manufacturing power. Shipyards, factories, and assembly lines across America began turning out aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ships in numbers that dwarfed German production, month after month, year after year. The war, in other words, had quietly transformed into something new. It wasn't only a contest of strategy and willpower anymore. It had become a war of production of who could simply build more, faster, and keep building even after losing enormous amounts of material. And by every measure that mattered, Germany was falling behind. In 1942, Hitler tried again, launching a massive new offensive south, this time aimed squarely at the oil fields of the Caucasus. The logic was simple and, in a way, unavoidable. Without oil, tanks couldn't move, aircraft couldn't fly, and the entire mechanized war machine Germany had built its early victories on would simply grind to a stop. That offensive led German forces into a city on the Volga River, whose name would come to define the entire war. What happened at Stalingrad became one of the deadliest battles in human history and one of the most brutal. It wasn't fought with sweeping tank maneuvers or fast-moving columns, the way earlier German victories had been. It was fought street by street, building by building, sometimes floor by floor. In close-quarters combat so intense that soldiers on both sides nicknamed it the Rat War. Snipers held entire city blocks hostage. Factories changed hands multiple times in a single day. Months bled into each other as both armies fed more and more men into the wreckage of a city that was, at that point, barely still standing. Despite repeated warnings from his own generals that the German Sixth Army was in danger of being completely encircled, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal. He insisted the city had to be held at all costs. Partly for strategic reasons, and partly, historians argue, because of the symbolic weight of a city that carried Stalin's name. The Soviets encircled the Sixth Army anyway, in an operation known as Uranus, trapping roughly 250,000 German and Axis soldiers inside a shrinking pocket with no way out. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could keep the trapped army supplied entirely by air. That promise proved hopelessly, tragically unrealistic. The planes that did get through delivered only a fraction of what the surrounded army actually needed. Starvation set in, ammunition ran dry, and then winter returned, just as brutal as the one the year before. In February 1943, after months of unimaginable suffering on both sides, the last surviving German forces at Stalingrad surrendered. It was the first time in the war that an entire German field army had been destroyed and forced to capitulate. Stalingrad was more than a lost battle. It marked the moment the war's momentum permanently shifted. From that point forward, Germany was almost always on the defensive, reacting to Soviet offensives rather than dictating the pace of the war itself. The Red Army pushed steadily westward year after year, reclaiming occupied territory until Soviet troops finally reached the outskirts of Berlin itself in the spring of 1945. Looking back across the whole arc of the war, many historians point to Operation Barbarossa as the single decision that made Germany's eventual defeat overwhelmingly likely, even if it wasn't yet certain in the summer of 1941. It dragged the country into a prolonged war against an opponent with almost unimaginable territory, deep natural resources, and critically, the sheer human capacity to keep replacing losses that would have broken almost any other nation, but it would be too simple to say. One decision alone explains everything that followed. As the war dragged on, Hitler's grip on military strategy grew more rigid, not less. He repeatedly overruled experienced field commanders. He refused strategic withdrawals, even when retreat clearly would have saved lives and resources. He insisted on holding indefensible positions purely out of stubbornness. And time and again, that stubbornness turned difficult situations into outright disasters. Germany also badly underestimated the industrial strength of the Allied powers. Along with their growing intelligence capabilities and technological progress, strategic bombing campaigns steadily crippled German industry from the air. Allied codebreakers, working in near-total secrecy, provided commanders with intelligence that shaped major campaigns, new weapons, expanding factory output, and increasingly coordinated operations between the Americans. British and Soviets slowly but decisively tipped the balance of the entire war. No single mistake explains everything about Germany's defeat. War rarely works that cleanly, but some mistakes change the entire shape of everything that comes after them. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a front stretching thousands of kilometers in every direction. It consumed irreplaceable numbers of trained soldiers. It stretched German logistics past their breaking point, and ultimately, it trapped Nazi Germany in a war of attrition against a combination of enemies whose combined resources it could never realistically hope to outlast. At the start of 1941, Adolf Hitler stood closer to dominating the European continent than perhaps any leader in modern history. Just 4 years later, Berlin lay in ruins. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and the war in Europe A war that had reshaped the entire 20th century had finally come to an end. Sometimes, the greatest mistake in history isn't losing a battle. It's starting a war you can no longer control.